I wanted the opening image to be Africa, just sunrise and the silhouette of a man hunting. It's a dream of an old woman who's now going back in her mind to try to see who this man was.
He even took the gramophone on safari. 3 rifles, supplies for a month, and Mozart.
You have the sense of a woman that you admire who gets under your skin. There's something about her courage and eloquence and wisdom. And she made Africa sound so marvelous and poetic.
I think the opening shot of the train and the shot of Meryl in the back of the train, that was like the springboard. As a composer, you look for something like that to lean on. That's where I get my input from. If it had just been a shot of a train, I would have been playing the scenery, virtually. But to have that shot of her with so much expression, so much joy and love, was a springboard. I had that heart to spring off. And then once it opened up to the rest of the train journey, it was playing the beauty of the country through her insight.
The air was sweeter than anything I've ever smelled in my life. And there were bird calls that I never recognized, because it is sort of paradise.
She was euphoric when she first arrived in the Highlands. Part of that is just the air of the Highlands. It's very high and very pure. There is a euphoria that everybody gets.
It's overwhelming. It's truly overwhelming, to the point where you say, if there was a Garden of Eden, this is where it would be.
There was the main melody, which gave it the size, and a certain kind of yearning in the melody. And then there was a counter melody, like a falling line that was originally played on the violas and then second violins and violas. Those counter melodies are almost more important than the actual melody. There's a sense of loss. We don't know that at the beginning of the movie, but as we develop on that counter melody, it starts to find its own dramatic level as the story progresses.
British East Africa in 1913 was a place where nature sanctioned the complete abandonment of civilized inhibitions. Serial monogamy was athletically practiced, and in the bars of steamers, women were accosted with the famous question, "Are you married, or do you live in Kenya?"
Sabu, I am Farad.
Farah introduced himself, this extraordinarily handsome and dignified figure from the 1001 Nights, and he was to be her maitre domo and her butler and her confidant. She was thrilled. She had imagined this in some ways, and here it was being presented to her.
Malik played with an intensity that bore through me. He was so connected to my character.
Please.
He carried his dignity ferociously through the shoot. The sense of this man's being much more important than anyone ever dreamed.
Listen, on the train are my crates with China and crystals. Do you know China?
Yes, Sabu. China. It can break.
Nairobi was a rough and ramshackle little town built around a railhead. The wooden sidewalks were shaded with rows of eucalyptus trees and lined with offices and bungalows roofed in corrugated tin. The thoroughfares were paved with red dust that turned to mud the color of ox blood when it rained.
Reproducing the city accurately, we did have to build it, and it's a pretty spectacular set. I wouldn't have attempted it in any other country. Stephen Grimes, a great production designer, went there and for a year built that city and built the railroad and found a house and built onto it that was like Karen Blixen's house. She made a marriage of convenience with this guy who turned out to be an absolute scoundrel, but completely charming. Took her money and bought coffee with it, which you can't grow in the Highlands. The first actor I wanted, and at a certain point it looked like I wasn't going to be able to get him, and I just could not think of another actor who could do it. He does every despicable thing possible to that woman, and they still end up friends, and you have to believe it.
Klaus was a difficult man. He's a very complicated man. He has a sense of unease that he carries around a lot. He isn't necessarily looking to have a good time on the movie like I am.
The first years of marriage to Bror were a voyage of discovery. They worked the farm together, determined to yield great harvests. They went on safari together, where Karen proved to be the equal of any hunter. But the love of adventure and the life force that it unleashed captured Bror completely. His boundless charm and stamina were soon legendary. He could drink through the night at the club and then safari all day. Karen was equally true to herself, and she preferred to be isolated on the farm. She had no patience for the prosaic pomp of the English colonialists. She cured her alienation by looking after the native population attached to her land.
I was a doctor to the people on the farm most mornings from 9 to 10. And like all great quacks, I had a large circle of patients. And generally between 2 and a dozen sick people up by my house then. I knew very little of doctoring, just what you learn at a first aid course. But my renown as a doctor had been spread by a few chance lucky cures, and had not been decreased by the catastrophic mistakes that I had made. Comante, to my surprise, turned up at my house the morning after our first meeting.
This will hurt.
Rarely have I met such a wild creature. A human being who was so utterly isolated from the world, and by a sort of firm, deadly resignation, completely closed to all surrounding life. I could make him answer when I questioned him.
Tell me your name. I am Comante.
But he never volunteered a word and never looked at me. His fortitude of soul in the face of pain was the fortitude of an old warrior. A thing could never be so bad as to surprise him. He was, by his career and his philosophy, prepared for the worst. From the day when Comante came into my service and attached his fate to mine, I felt his watchful, penetrating eyes on me, and my whole modus vivendi subject to clear, unbiased criticism. I believe that from the beginning he looked upon the trouble that I had taken to get him cured as upon a piece of hopeless eccentricity. But he showed me all the time great interest and sympathy, and he laid himself out to guide my great ignorance.
Mimi kama bana memza. Mimi nakufa kwa hii Mungu.
The civilized people have lost the aptitude of stillness and must take lessons in silence from the wild before they are accepted by it. When you have caught the rhythm of Africa, you find that it is the same in all her music. What I learned from the game of the country was useful to me in my dealings with the native people.
At night, we would hear the lions. I thought it was the neighbors at first because they were going, sounded like heartburn next door, you know, but it was lions. I thought lions went, but they don't. They go,
There's a war going on out there between the animals. You hear them start up, and the next morning you get in your Jeep and you drive and you see carcasses all over the place. And you see the food chain working perfectly. The lion kills the zebra, and the vultures stand and wait.
The first time you wake up to the sound of a lion roaring, it's the most penetrating sound you've ever heard. There's nothing like it.
It was the last day of shooting, and this lion is supposed to be tethered. I'm whipping using this bullwhip, and I crack it near the lion. It was too far away for me to actually hurt him. This lion was tethered, and as long as it was tethered, it would sit there like this. And I would whip it, you know, with fury, and it would go. So Sidney was tearing his hair out. Just the day before we're supposed to leave, we're all supposed to, he's had it. It's like endless shoot, I guess, for him. And he goes, untie the lion, don't tell her. So he untethers the lion. And I go, and they're like,
I love Meryl Streep so much I would never, ever contradict anything that she said. But I would have to ask any sane person whether they believe I would actually untie a lion and let it loose on my actress. I think that's a little bit of creative memory going on. She was very brave. She did get close to these lions. But the lions were brought from the United States, and the lions always had their trainers around them. We did everything we could to protect Meryl. What we did do, and maybe this is what Meryl's talking about, there's a sequence early on in the film where she's out alone and she looks up, and there's a female lioness. And that lion was let completely free.
I wouldn't run. If you do, she'll think you're something good to eat.
Shoot it.
She's had breakfast.
That lion was looking right at its trainer, who was right behind Meryl, and we were all assured by everybody that that lioness was going to come to the trainer when the trainer took out food and held it up. And that's exactly what happened.
Just how much closer did you expect to let her come?
A bit.
Dennis was the son of an earl. He'd been educated at Eton. He was a classical scholar and a lover of modern music and art. He was very handsome, very elusive. Today we would say he was afraid of commitment. I think everybody in Africa was afraid of commitment. It was the place where you went, you know, when you were afraid of commitment, you went and became a hunter in the highlands or ran a coffee farm. He was not going to settle down and raise a family and be a husband. Dennis was able to play with her verbally. He had a terrific sense of humor and a great sense of irony. And he wasn't intimidated by her. She liked to say Roy didn't know whether the Renaissance came before or after the Crusades. Dennis was her match.
He was a terrific hunter. A lot of women were in love with him. And he was the pinnacle of the unattainable guy. Now, at first, I didn't think of Redford at all. But I felt that you had to reduce this thing to essentials. The essential thing is unpossessable. And Redford is more of that than any British actor I knew.
Finch Hatton, as we tried to imagine him, really wanted Africa to stay exactly as it was the moment that he first set foot in Africa.
Did you really think it would stay the way it was?
I thought it might.
Dennis deeply admired the unique qualities of the Maasai, and he tried to help them when the colonial government took away their spears and shields, robbing them not only of their ability to fight, and thus stop lions from raiding their herds, but also of their identity. The British plutocrats condemned because they could not comprehend a race that did not define itself by its economic utility. Karen venerated the Maasai, for they were completely true to their own nature and to an unspoken ideal. Their daring and fantastical style had grown from the inside and was an expression of the race and its history.
They had real courage, the unadulterated liking of danger, the true answer of creation to the announcement of their lot, the echo from the earth when heaven had spoken. I sometimes thought that what at the bottom of their hearts they feared from us was pedantry. In the hands of a pedant they die of grief.
It's the only cue in the movie where I used an African percussion. It's the only place where we actually went to that, and those strange flute sounds, those strange wind sounds. That was the only area where we touched on the feeling of indigenous African music.
I have really thick books just to deal with the various tribes that were here and be authentic with their dress and their dialects that they speak.
Wakitazama upande huu, haswa kamera yenyewe. Tafadhalini. Bring him. Go, Roy! Okay. Cut.
The one area in the movie that I actually rewrote was the journey. I took it as her entering into the journey in a very positive, triumphant way, and then The journey became more tiresome, and she winds up finally meeting in the most exhaustive state. So I took it, if you like, what we call hairpins. I took it big and then took it right down. I went with the spiritual thing of the diminishing of her spirit, and was she ever going to get there? That was a dramatic line I took. And Sidney said, this is totally wrong. He said, let's do it totally the other way. Start out small and go virtually against the picture. So we're seeing a decline in the visuals. He wanted the music to build in a spirit.
In those days, at that time, and in that place, conversation was a highly prized art. You could spend 5 days getting to see somebody. And when you went, you were invited to stay the night. There was no radio, there was no television, there were no movies to run, there was no video cassette. You talked. It was what you did. And she was a great conversationalist. And so was Finch Hatton.
Just as Scheherazade told stories to ward off the tragic fate that was in store for her in the morning, her tragic fate was Dennis's leaving.
In the very beginning of the shoot, and we didn't know each other very well at all, Sidney wanted to go over and over and over on his coverage, and he said, tell me a story. So I told, I think, 30 stories. And that was the day I earned my money.
She formalizes her own figure as the timeless, the ageless storyteller, not the woman who suffers. And the woman who suffers and struggles and weeps and loves and loses is the character in the film. And that is actually the historical Isaac Dinesen rather than the literary Isaac Dinesen. Her father had syphilis, and the family believed that was the reason that he shot himself. So as a fatalist looking at the ironies of life, she could accept this as a sort of mark of fate.
If it didn't sound so beastly, I might say that the world being as it is, it was worthwhile having syphilis in order to become a baroness. As I lay in the hospital in Copenhagen, I yearned for Africa and was afraid that the difficulties of a journey out would be so great that I could never get back.
Dennis was one of the first to take advantage of motor vehicles on safari. When the slaughter of animals escalated, Dennis turned to photographic safaris. Like Karen before him, he did everything he could to prevent the spread of a cancer that he had helped to grow. He published an essay in the Times of London where he stated the situation. It is only by proper use of the motor car that the great pleasures and privilege of observing these animals can at present be enjoyed. And it is by abuse of the motor car for shooting purposes, training the animals to sooner or later connect it with man, that this privilege will be destroyed. If anything is to be done about it, it must be done quickly.
Her father wrote a very wonderful memoir about hunting and the relationship of the hunter and the prey and the old-fashioned gallantry of the chase. And she discovered bloodlust, which she then later came to disavow. But in the beginning, she shot and killed hundreds of animals.
Regarding lions, I can only say that I do not believe that any normal person can live in lion country without trying to shoot them. Perhaps it is wrong from the moral point of view, but seen in relation to the lion itself, I must say that if someone should come and shoot me in the full vigor of youth, so that I died in 5 minutes without having any suspicion of it in advance, I would be sincerely grateful to them and not resent them standing looking at my last moments with deep admiration for my greatness. Nature's plan for human beings with a long decline and long drawn-out suffering is so hard that it seems no disgrace to intervene with a brisk bullet.
Shoot!
Judith Thurman on BA's flight to Nairobi. And I said, think of a romantic thing for Dennis to do to Karen. Judith loves assignments like that. Looked at the ceiling for a while, and then she said, he could wash her hair.
Lay your head back.
We were out in the tents, sleeping at night, and I heard what sounded like a washing machine backing up. If you've heard this sound. You know, it sounded like a terrible, terrible plumbing problem. So I got up, and I looked through the little screen outside, and right as far as you're sitting from me, what looked like 2 Volkswagens were going. It was 2 hippos. They were so close to my tent that the wind from their clash was, making the sides go. And I thought this was hilarious. Hippos, they're so funny and cute. The next day they told me that more people are killed by hippos than any other animal in Africa. We were shooting the washing the hair scene with some hippos in the water who were not imported like some of the lions were brought from California. These were native hippos who didn't know, that this was Robert Redford and me. They were gonna, if you get between them and the water apparently, or between them and their offspring, they'll just eat you. So I was more scared of doing the hair washing scene than the beating up the lion scene.
On safari with Dennis, Karen succeeded in bringing together all of her erotic components: the untamed African landscape, the sensitive and fearless wandering male, and the energetic sharing of stories after a day of adventure. Dreams could not match these moments.
It's almost like a negative cue. I remember playing it to my wife, and she said, "What's that?" I said, "That's for the love scene." She said, "I don't know about that." And I didn't know about it, except when I played it against picture, it worked. I could have repeated either her theme or the main theme, which would have been traditional, I guess, in a romantic movie, but I just stepped right back from it. The whole feeling had a tentative quality to it. And that's what I wanted to capture, because I think if you'd have gushed, it would take right away from the picture.
Sydney wanted a sensual quality to her that would go with the landscape as he saw it of Africa. He didn't think that I was sexy enough to play Isaac Dinesen, that sex pot. But, it's a movie, and I understood that. But I went for the meeting. I finally wrangled a meeting. And I went pathetically in a very low-cut blouse with a push-up bra. I'm very ashamed to say it, but I did. And it worked. That's the really sad part.
Flying suits Dennis so perfectly. I have always felt that he has so particularly much of the element of air in his makeup, and was a kind of aerial.
You see the whole landscape of Africa, and you see this little plane. The plane is like a mosquito, and that's why I used the choir. Sydney originally thought of that in a more triumphant way, I think. And I saw it as a totally spiritual way. It just breaks into something which they were already familiar with, and to be able to sing it out that loud, I think that's probably the largest use of the melody. I think that's why it was so effective. It's the height of spirituality, the whole being together, and the whole magnificence of the land, and to experience that while in flight, it's the ultimate fulfillment of everything.
Once when Dennis and I had been up and were landing on the plain of the farm, a very old Kikuyu came up and talked to us. "Did you see God?" he asked. "No, Ndweri," I said. "We did not see God." "And you, Baydar," he said, turning to Dennis, "what do you think? Will you get up high enough in your aeroplane to see God?" "Really, I do not know," said Dennis. Then said Ndweri, "I do not know at all why you two go flying."
As a Dane, she had a different attitude to the Africans than the English did.
Tráilers. Visita mi canal.
She wasn't a sort of modern liberal involved with the rights of the Africans, but she was tolerant and curious and open to them in a way that the English were not. She admired the way that their societies worked. They were very functional. They had courts. They had a sense of justice. The English took a much more colonial view of the Africans, and they resented her for what they said was spoiling the natives.
There's always some sort of a conflict of ways of looking at life. Sometimes it's cultural, sometimes it's political, sometimes it's just emotional, and that's usually at the center of the love story.
Sidney said, I need to see the film in a line, and Meryl was the one who came up with it, and she said, Out of Africa is the story of a woman whose lover was more beautiful than she was.
I imagined it as when her idea of herself collapsed, when her invention collapsed, her powers of invention. And you just can't believe in the illusion that you've been manufacturing.
There was an element of masochism in her love for him. Keeping herself worthy was sort of a full-time task when he was there. There's an adrenaline rush involved in that kind of attachment, which I think she thrived on. She took a very old-fashioned view of marriage. It was a social pact. You married for sensible reasons, and the actual experience was less important than the sense that you were fulfilling your role. And she was perfectly willing to let Bror go his way, and she had gone her way, and she didn't see why they couldn't remain married. But the woman he was in love with had insisted on his making an honest woman of her. He did what he could to help her, but he was really very absent in the last months, weeks and months before she was to leave and before his plane crashed. There was some sort of row, that was the word her friends used to describe it. And whether it was about another woman or whether it was about his unwillingness to help her, I think maybe she even expected that he might offer to marry her at that point so she could stay in Africa.
I began to see the movie as a dramatization of the idea of possession in some way, between two people and between countries.
Rationally, she knew she couldn't possess him and probably didn't want to, that was his essence. But the woman wanted him and wanted to marry him and wanted to be the Honorable Mrs. Dennis Van Chatten.
His selfishness was his weakness, and that her possessiveness was her weakness. His selfishness about protecting his individuality was his Achilles heel, and her need to be assured of closeness was her Achilles heel. He's just not going to bend. Is that good? Depends on your point of view. I don't think it's good, but it's attractive. I can remember one argument Meryl and I had, and only one in the whole picture, and that was over a line in which she had to say,
I won't allow it, Dennis.
she didn't want to say that.
You have no idea the effect that language has on me.
And I understand why she didn't want to say it. But if you don't get to the flaw, you can't finish the relationship. He had to say, you have no idea the effect that language has on me. She says, in the world in which you want, there would be no love at all. And he says, or the best kind, where you didn't have to prove it every 5 minutes. They both have valid arguments.
I'm going to Samburu. She can come or not.
The idea of the roaming male and the female who wants to keep him in a place.
And you'll be living elsewhere.
That's the tension of the love story, I think, as they saw it. That she was just trying to settle him down, or something. But I think that that Isaac Dinesen herself is more interesting than that.
The Pandora, who presumably shrieked and clutched at Dennis, was released from a cauldron of despair. Karen would never write about this painful history, not only because she preferred to forget, but also because it hardly seemed to belong to her.
She really did try her best to provide for them. It was considered extraordinarily eccentric and wild, even mad of her to try to do this. For her, it was a matter of honor. Honor was the key word. That's what she felt was missing from the modern world.
You have mine.
She struggled and pulled every string that she could and did tremendous amount of work to have them resettled on a piece of land.
The Kikuyu took the situation better than I did, on account of their superior inside knowledge of God and the devil. But they sat round my house and waited for my orders, very likely all of the time between themselves, expatiating freely upon my ignorance and my unique incapacity.
There was a fundamental injustice done by the very nature of the colonial project in Kenya.
I have trouble with romanticizing that kind of an organization.
Rose-lipped maidens, light-foot lads.
Thinking it's so wonderful that she's allowed to go in and have a drink at the bar. Well, big fucking deal. Makes you want to say, well, I don't want to be in your club anyway. You know, if you live with a great deal of happiness, or the thing that you love the most, or you care about the most, you always secretly in the back of your mind think it will be taken away. And it's, aha. You know, the gods have found out what I care about most.
I thought sort of symbolically of the dirt of Africa, the dirt that she has in her hand almost becoming the ink that a pen got dipped into when she became a writer.
She was the sum of her experiences. She was the sum of her losses. The death of Dennis is really the stroke that rounds out the story. It was a tragedy, but what would she have been had he not died? She just would have been a woman who had lost her farm and lost her lover, and everybody would have gone on to another life. This was really the stroke of fate that rounds out the story of Out of Africa.
It was certainly one of the most beautiful places in the world for letting a spirit go. When my 10-year-old son watched the movie, the only time he cried was when she said goodbye to Farah, and we're just saying goodbye to Africa.